Hi, I'm Femi OK, and you're in the stream live on Al Jazeera and on YouTube. Today, ISIL has been defeated on the battlefield, but is that really the end? Many experts say the conflict continues and that the front line is digital.
I'm Malika Bilal. So does defeat in Iraq and Syria mean ISIL's ideology has been tackled, or is that war just beginning? Today we'll hear from a panel of experts and the former wife of an ISIL commander.
Last month, more than 3 years after ISIL captured Raqqa in Syria, it was pushed out of the city that had become, in effect, its capital and the hub from which it controlled its operations. After a series of battlefield defeats, this was seen by many as the final blow to the group's ambition to hold territory and build its so-called caliphate. But was it really the end of ISIL itself? Many experts say the war continues in one space that ISIL has always been strong: online. But will the group's defeats on the ground in Iraq and Syria affect its ability to pump out information and recruit people to its cause?
Well, joining us on set, Harun Ullah is author of Digital World War. In Plano, Texas, Tanya Joya is a counterterrorism consultant. She was married to a man who became an ISIL commander and spent time with him in Syria. In Canterbury, in the UK, Fahid Qureshi is a lecturer in criminology at Canterbury Christ Church University. And in Baghdad, Imran Khan is an Al Jazeera correspondent in the Middle East and South Asia.
Welcome, everybody. It's good to have you with us. Imran, you have covered the rise of ISIL around the Middle East. Where is the organization now that there have been defeats in Syria, in Iraq? What would you say in terms of territory that it holds? How are they doing?
Well, physical territory, particularly here in Iraq, in recent days, they've actually lost their remaining territory. That was Ramana. And now, because they've lost that territory, they're now moving into the online space. And this, as you say, was something they were very good at. Now, when they get into the online, building their message, and they're pushing it really forward through a number of different means. They're looking at things like instant messaging apps that are secure, Telegram, WhatsApp, Signal, that kind of thing. But they're also still using traditional websites to get their message out. So they have disappeared, particularly in Iraq. They don't really control any territory anymore. But the digital space is so much more difficult for any counterterrorism experts, any counterterrorism forces to get at, because it's so open.
Let me just show our audience a little bit of a map, and this map is Syria in the last year, so you can see what's happened to ISIL. Look for the black areas, and we'll go from 2016 all the way up until 2017 November, and you can see those black areas growing and then shrinking, and this is where we are right now.
So from the online battlefield, we got this comment on Facebook from Boomashu, who says what it looks like online is you can kill them in the battlefields, but if their ideas are not wiped off in all domains, then it's almost impossible to declare a victory over them. Harun, you look at this comment, do you agree with it? And what does that online landscape even look like? How would you go about declaring a victory there?
Yeah, so online, what I think of it is it's the information battlefield. And at the heart of this, Malika, is that this is a content war. And I think a lot of people lose sight of that. And, you know, ISIL, in a lot of ways, a lot of people declared victory when they saw the pictures in Raqqa and in Mosul. But what they forget about is they've built this ecosystem online. So you have people like Muhammad al-Arafi, who a lot of people haven't heard of in the West or haven't heard of around the world. But he's the #1 person on Twitter in the Middle East. And he's a cleric that's oftentimes the biggest driver of why young people were joining ISIL. And, you know, this is part of their fanboys and their influence.
I'm just looking at some of the publications that ISIL have put out over the years. We have Dabiq, we have right now, we've got Ramia. Fahid, this shrinking in terms of actual territory in the offline world, what does that mean for territory in the online world? What are you seeing that's changed?
Well, I think that one of the things that we see with the online content of ISIS is that it's actually very media savvy. So it recognizes the value of online engagement. And I think that as it's losing territory in Iraq and Syria, that online engagement with its audience has become much more important. And so we see very efficient, very snazzy magazines that it produces. And it uses a language which is one that young people in particular who are looking at this material can recognize. It's a rhetoric of empowerment, and there's a lot of work now coming out from some universities. People like Gareth Thompson have been looking at this work. And they look at the kind of rhetoric and the kind of language and the narratives that are being produced, a kind of rhetoric of empowerment and dignity, offering some kind of answers to some of the social problems that young Muslims are dealing with in Europe and other parts of the world. They're recognizing these issues. And I think that emphasizes the value of these kinds of organizations because they're speaking to the concerns of young people.
Tanya, when you...
Can I just say something here?
Yeah,
this
sure,
is
Imran,
something something that's really interesting here. I think we have to make a real definition. There are two very different types of ISIL. There are those that went and fought, and they were in Syria, they were in Iraq, and they picked up guns. And then there are those who have never fought, who are in the online space. And they're talking about ISIL and the dignity, as the last guest just pointed out, and the problems that Muslims face in Europe. But they've never picked up a gun. These are the... if you will. So I think it's really important that we make this distinction.
Tanya, let me just bring you in here because your story is really tied into this rise of ISIL. You met your husband back in, was it 2009? What was it?
2003.
2003. What was it that you were seeing online, that he was seeing online, that was so compelling and attractive?
Our goals for a caliphate were really what drew us together. He had the advantages that I didn't have. He could read Arabic fluently. He knew the Middle East. Well, he wasn't afraid to go to the Middle East, so I liked that about him. And he knew Syria. I looked up to his knowledge of the Middle East and his devotion.
Fahid was talking about how a lot of the material is designed to bring in young people, for them to find it appealing. Do you remember looking at anything online that made you feel like, okay, this is talking to me, this resonates with me?
Yeah, there's a lot of push and pull factors. The pull factors, it had a lot to do with war propaganda that was, as a community, we felt obliged to help each other. And when we saw children and women being victims of Muslim genocide, I guess it would be called, that we perceived, from Western powers and invaders, we wanted a solution, and that we felt, online we were seeing all the pictures, and then we would see Western propaganda demeaning Muslims, and these were push and pull factors that, pulled me towards the ideology and pulled others to it.
Yeah, and what Tanya said is exactly right. So that, what she's getting on is its audience segmentation. So ISIL understands their audience. They say one thing in Arabic, they say another thing in English. They understand where there may be vulnerable youth or at-risk youth. They have different channels, like as Imran and Fahad were suggesting. They use open source for certain things, Twitter and Facebook, that they moved to end-to-end encryption. Telegram, they'll use WhatsApp. They'll use a new app called Saraha, which is really big in the Arab world, an honesty app. So they fail fast. I mean, what Tanya is getting at is that they know how to perfect their pitch.
So one of the comments,
Can I just come in on?
One of the comments, and I'll direct this to you, Fahad. This is a comment via Facebook. Ibrahim says, ISIS is an ideology based on misinterpretation of religion and fueled by injustice of Arab dictators, as well as despair of the youth from ever making their countries great again. He goes on to say, as long as these causes exist side by side with the hefty load of weapons from America, there will always be tens of organizations like ISIS. And this is really picking up on a point that Imran made earlier about those who are fighting and those who have an ideology that they are seeking out online. Fahad, when you look at this as the impetus behind why people might join organizations like this, how do you even begin to tackle that?
I mean, I think it's a very interesting comment. Over the last few weeks and months, we've been seeing media reports that are hailing the defeat of ISIS. But I think that that's a little bit premature. I think that we can't look at organizations like ISIS in isolation. They are a product of broader wars that have been going on now for several decades. And just as a few years ago, people were talking about the end of Al Qaeda. In its place, we had ISIS, and I think that this is not something that we should see in isolation. I think that if we're interested in serious, I don't think that it's accurate to say that we can end terrorism, but I think that we can do certain things that mean that the likelihood of terrorism happening are significantly reduced, so that we can do some things to manage the problem of terrorism. And I think that there are things like wars, militarism, and these kinds of things. The arms trade as well is quite significant, particularly in the UK. The UK is the second largest arms dealer in the world. So I think that these are some of the things, some of the big things that we can look at if we're interested in dealing with terrorism. But it is important to say that I don't think that there is a sort of silver bullet that would deal with the issue of terrorism.
So what Fahad said is exactly right. So there's a blueprint, and a lot of times what I talk about in my book, I take a data-driven approach, which is we have data that backs up what works. How do you win the war on the information battlefield? So one thing is that you can't just do tit-for-tat narratives. And a lot of times it causes backfire effect. So if someone says the caliphate is bountiful, and someone else responds in sort of a counter-narrative as they're not bountiful, that oftentimes can reinforce a predisposed belief. So what does work is defector narratives, and I interviewed a lot of them in my research for my book. Voices of mothers are very influential. And then there's these thousands of stories of these Malalas, the young Malalas out there that are organic, authentic narratives. And that's why I talk about a Manhattan Project. We really need a collection of talent and technology. There's a blueprint for how to win this on the information battlefield.
Imran, you're actually
There is
offline.
absolutely, Fahad.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry.
You go first. Go ahead.
There is actually a blueprint. Yeah, there is actually a blueprint, and what Harunullah is saying is absolutely right. But I do think what you've got to understand, particularly where I am in Baghdad, is as ISIL becomes defeated, online, their presence becomes stronger in terms of rhetoric. Yes, we have been defeated, but we will prevail. This is just one battle that that's taking place, and we have lost territory. And they admit, ISIL through their propaganda channels admit that they've lost territory, but they say this is the long war. And the defeat almost strengthens the message that they've got. And this is phenomenally interesting for me because there's a fatalism to what ISIL are, to what Al-Qaeda in Iraq were. They say, doesn't matter what's going on with us, we will prevail. Talking a narrative that lasts 5 or 6 or 7 years. I mean, this is something that they say will go on for 1,000 years, that they will win eventually. So that's something we also really need to look at when we talk about rhetoric and how to defeat the group.
Yeah. And so pulling that rhetoric down to what it actually looks like in real life, there's a tweet we got from Sharif. He says, I have a friend who receives a bunch of ISIL videos and follows them on social media platforms. The propaganda is too strong. He even regards going to Somalia his biggest dream. I don't really know how to react with him, but I told him not to show me the videos again. And I know everyone could weigh in here, but Tanya, I want to give this one to you. What would you tell Sharif?
I would I would tackle the ideology first, because it's the ideology that unites the extremists. And I would really just try and break it up and, make them question and compare their ideology to other systems, other forms of social justice systems, and just try and pick apart their arguments as best as I can, because I feel like if we can just present statistics, even like not specifically to that case, but if terrorism data statistics were presented and they were showing that terrorism and violence it doesn't achieve the goals, the political goals that they're trying to achieve, if they just see that it's not going to be successful, maybe they might think twice.
So what Tanya brings up exactly right is that there's this idea that, in online, you have an interesting dynamic. So I call it the 1-9-90 model, which is that 1% of people online create content. They're key influencers. 9% are content curators. They share content. 90% are consumers, oftentimes the people that Tanya is talking about, those that receive content. And so in terms of winning this, in terms of fighting back to sort of against this ideology, it's mobilizing that 90%, right? The content is there, but how do you get people on the sidelines that are willing to participate in this battle?
And your answer to your own question is what?
Well, they need to get platforms. We have to enable, it's a combination of the private sector, government, and civil society working together. You take a holistic approach, you have community leaders, you have religious leaders that are on the front lines, but how do you let those stories be told? Because at the end of the day, as I said, this is a content war. Imran's talking about ISIL. Well, they're putting out online maybe 5,000 to 10,000 pieces of social media a day. And they're building their fanboys network. And so that's why we have to mobilize that 90%. Because, look, I take this example. When we see Nazi content online, I think it's so horrific. I don't feel the need to say anything against it. And a lot of people in that 90% category, that's the way they view ISIL. It's not related to religion. It has nothing to do with them. And in fact, most of the propaganda that ISIL does, less than 10% of it actually has to do with religion. 80% is positive messaging. A lot of times we talk about the dark narratives. Well, that's in English. But if you look at Arabic, a lot of it's about governance, a lot of it's about corruption, and the social justice things that Tanya talked about. So we have to think about collecting the best talent, the narratives that actually work, because that's what we need this Manhattan Project.
Okay, so that's one idea. Here's another you might agree with. This is someone on Twitter saying social media companies should identify and block quote unquote terrorist accounts as much as they can. A simple solution, though, yet a difficult one. Another person picks up on that and says there needs to be a proper mechanism to report handles and groups set up by social media sites and be taken down immediately when reported. Also, a counter narrative to their evil ideology is the need of the hour. Fahad, I know that social media organizations are being tasked with this because governments are bringing them to task to do what they can. But what do you make of that argument?
I mean, it is true that this is happening now. So just recently, I think it was YouTube deleted 50,000 videos by Anwar al-Awlaki, who was, I think, killed in a drone strike several years ago by the American military. But I think that we also need to think about the longer term consequences of those kinds of moves, because it can lead to a stifling of political engagement, political discussions, and it can have other sort of unintended consequences that can be quite dangerous. The other thing I would like to say here is I think that it's very clear that the online space is a big battle space for the hearts and minds, and I think that that's true for both terrorist organizations but also counter-terrorist organizations, right? So just as much as we're talking about the rhetoric and the messaging of terrorist organizations, there's something that counterterrorism organizations are also trying to do as well in their messaging, you know, playing on notions of heroism and evil, encouraging cultures of vigilance and reporting, making counterterrorism look kind of efficient. And also saying something about what is correct Islam and what is not correct Islam, what is the good way to be a Muslim, and what is not a good way to be a Muslim. In the research that's been conducted by Gareth Thompson, for example, he looks at some of the magazines, the Dabiq magazines that ISIS produce. And what he finds is actually there's quite an interesting similarity in the kinds of visual rhetorics that are being employed. So they use kind of, on the one hand, ISIS use kind of rhetoric that young people will be familiar with, like I think it's called Call of Duty. It's a first-person shooter game, using those kinds of languages. And I think that they learn that from the American counter-terrorists who use games like the American Army to try and recruit, you know, young people into the American Army right at the early period of the war on terror. So I think that the important thing out of all of this is there is messaging going on both sides, but in the middle, the audience for both groups is an audience that is a thinking, rational audience. It's important to recognize that this is not like a zombie audience that is easily brainwashed. This is an audience that is thinking, that is looking at different arguments and making decisions, that they're thinking about the value of different arguments from different sides. And I think that when we think about why it is that certain people might join different organizations, we need to think about what it is about the message that resonates with young people.
Well, what the message is that it's an aspirational identity. And look, they're playing on people like Tanya mentioned, her husband. And going back to what Malika said, look, there's a role for censorship. I think it's overplayed, frankly, because, you know, as fast as they can take down content, these groups are evolving. And we talk about ISIS, but there's also ISIS 2.0 and 3.0. They use like kitten and Nutella. And so, like, what are we going to do? You're going to start taking down two of my favorite things? The idea is that they're using now coded language and they're being more sophisticated in what they put up on open source.
Imran, go ahead.
Well, let me tell you just a personal example. In 2014, when I really started covering the rise of ISIL as a territorial entity, I was able to go onto Twitter, go to a few accounts, and I was able to talk to ISIL fighters in Iraq, particularly up in Beji. There were a number of English-speaking and Arabic-speaking Pakistanis as well that were on Twitter. You could direct message them at the time. That was really useful. It was a primary source. It was a couple of guys on the ground that I could speak to. When Facebook and Twitter started shutting those accounts down, when they stopped allowing me to post news reports about ISIL saying that it was in violation of their standards, it became problematic. Now, it becomes even more problematic when we're trying to censor that online space, because security services are clearly taking a look at all the material that we as journalists and academics and researchers are looking at as well. The problem is when you have access to this material, when you are looking into this, and particularly on the dark web as well, which is another space that ISIL use, you become very paranoid that you might be arrested as a journalist because you're looking at all of this material. You're speaking with people who are giving you information about why people join ISIL, why they're fighting. Now, this, for me, is a real problem when it comes to freedom of speech and the ability to... We need to really understand that censorship doesn't really work in the way that we want it to work. Yes, there's one way of shutting people down, but they'll always find another way of getting their message out. So whether it's censorship or not, it's how we get there and how we're allowed to report and research. Because the last thing you want, and this has happened to people in Turkey, they've simply been journalists, they've been using encrypted messaging apps, they have some ISIL contacts on there, and they've been arrested.
All right, guys, let me show our audience this, because you've been talking about messaging from counter-terrorist organizations and then messaging from ISIL. Let me show you something called UTurn. Have a look.
شوف العلامة حقتك فوق.
So what I love about UTurn, and you can just see in that clip there, is that they're edgy. They're based in Jeddah. I've spent time with their CEO. They're like a social media incubator. They're producing viral content. They're doing things that are newsy, but they're doing stuff that's creative with young people, and they're tackling ISIL directly. They're doing things in comedy, satire. They're doing things directly speaking to the same youth that are vulnerable. They're presenting another alternative. They say, you know what, we're frustrated like you too. We also have discontent with what's going on. We're not happy about what happened in the Arab Spring, but this is how we're channeling it. And here are more positive ways that you can channel this sort of frustration. And they get millions of views, and we need that type of a thing. Hackathons, social media incubators, voices of defectors, voices of victims. That's how you win.
So it's a real cultural battle there for, excuse the cliche, hearts and minds. Tanya, I'm just going to show these two pictures of your ex-husband. This is John here, and he was fighting in 2004, in 2014, excuse me, in Syria. That's him with two of your youngsters. And then again here in Syria. Do you think that kind of messaging, those kind of videos, would have changed his mind about where he wanted to be?
No, I mean, he is particularly stubborn, but I mean, I often think, like, what could I have said, and I tried to say to him to get him to turn around and change his mind. But I think for me, it was, again, I just questioned his idea of social justice.
Right.
And if that's what ISIS was really doing. But
so it's not that easy. It's not necessarily who's on Twitter, who's in the dark web. Much more complicated than that. Thank you to our guests for being part of this conversation. It continues online, as always, using the hashtag AJStream. See you there.